Hello, I'm Mariah Woolridge, and today we're going to be talking about realms of cognition in middle childhood, which is chapter 6 of your textbook. I'm really excited to talk about this because we're starting to move on to middle childhood, where the previous lectures had been more along the lines of infancy up to like age 4 or 5. Now we're going to be talking about 4 or 5 to like age 10, which is a very different time in a child's life, in any person's life, than it would be in their infancy or toddlerhood. And if you've been around children, you absolutely know this. Children 5 to 10 are nothing like toddlers. They have a lot of really unique characteristics, and I'm excited to dive into them with you. So, brains in middle childhood might be close to their full size. They are 95% of their peak size by age 6, which is quite a bit. But they are far from being done developing. The brain is more connected, and communications between brain areas increase. Those myelination increases that speed of their neural signals. So their brains are getting really, really fast at communicating. They can skip steps that they would normally have needed to go through as a toddler. They're able to like think through very quickly. So we see a lot of increase in like logic and humor at this age too, intentional humor. And genes and experience will interact dynamically. So children's brains will develop kind of normally if we have like a very normal kind of situation. Children's brains will develop normally through genetic signaling, but their environment also plays a role in when their brains begin to develop as well. So genetics might tell your brain when to develop certain things or when to begin certain processes. But environment obviously matters. This week you'll be talking reading and listening more about ACE scores, and those absolutely impact the brain as well. And that's an environmental input, not a genetic one. So you'll be interested in knowing more about that when you get to those videos. But they're very important. The chapter also talks a lot about ADHD, and I love to talk about ADHD, so I'm going to talk quite a bit about it. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a neurodevelopmental disorder, which is a little bit different than like your anxiety and depression in that it's a way that your brain is structured and it's different. It's electrically and chemically different if you have ADHD than it is if you are neurotypical. ADHD is neuroatypical, which is why it's atypical development up there at the top of the slide. So ADHD is a cluster of symptoms, which is problematic for school. It will have to show up at home. That's part of the diagnostic criteria, but it's definitely a problem for school. Poor attention control, restlessness, hyperactivity, impulsivity. We all know kids who have ADHD, likely, more than likely anyway. However, ADHD is more than just school symptoms. It is also procrastination. It is also restlessness and speaking out of turn and muscle tension. And is very, very comorbid with depression and anxiety. There's also a term called masking, which it happens for a lot of girls at this age. Just to hop into social development a little bit. Girls don't typically get diagnosed with ADHD as often, even though there's no evidence to suggest that girls should get it less often. This is because girls tend to mask their symptoms a little bit more successfully as society kind of wants them to do so. Girls might be more inattentive than hyperactive, whereas boys might be more hyperactive. But girls are typically better at masking their symptoms, which is not necessarily good for them. It can cause a lot of stress for them to have to mask symptoms quite a bit. 5 to 10% of school-age children are diagnosed with ADHD, which seems like kind of a high number compared to like other types of disorders, especially this young. However, there is really high inheritance rates of ADHD. If you have one parent with ADHD, they're anywhere between 60 to 80% likely to pass that genetic marker for ADHD onto their children. So if a set of parents, one who has ADHD, have 4 children, 3 of them might end up having ADHD, which is, pretty high number. However, we hear a lot about misdiagnosed ADHD, which is true. Researchers begin to identify neurological differences that align with behavioral differences. But down here, where it talks about half of ADHD cases remit, that's because children's brains just develop in all kinds of interesting and unique ways, and not all at the same time. If you expect a first grader to sit in their chair and listen for, anything more than 30 minutes, they're probably going to have some difficulty with that without engaging them in other ways. So specific ways of teaching can be really beneficial to all children. to engage with their attention. However, all children have differences in impulsivity. All children have differences in attentional control. All children have differences in their hyperactivity or activity in general, but not all children have ADHD. Again, it is a neurodevelopmental disorder. It is a difference in brain structure, which is less dopamine in your prefrontal cortex and more electrical and chemical activity in all areas of the brain when there shouldn't necessarily be that electrical and chemical activity. Look up default mode network if you want to know more about that, because that's the electrical and chemical activity that I'm talking about. But anyway, all of that to say, there's a significant amount of normal variation, uneven brain development in middle childhood. Not all children are the same, but they will eventually become to that point. Neurotypical children will come to that point kind of on their own if there's no other environmental or genetic factors that hold them back. Then we're going to talk about cognitive development in middle childhood. And Piaget's stage at this point is concrete operational stage. And this concrete operational stage is children will construct their own theories about their world. They're very, if you tell them something, they know exactly what you're talking about and want to know more, but they are often not able to reason through things as well. They have their own ideas and beliefs about the world that they live in, and they will take new information and kind of assimilate it. This is where they don't necessarily believe wholesale. They'll like scaffold it onto what they already believe. So teaching does work, but if you tell a child something that goes completely against their worldview, they'll try to adapt it into their worldview versus just completely believe what you say 100%. For example, me as a child, I did not know why the ocean was salty. And I was a religious child, so I believed that God or Jesus had probably just dropped their salt shaker into the ocean, and that's why it was salty from up in the sky. That was a belief I had during early childhood that I obviously know now is not the case. But that's just an example. The egocentrism of children at this age is really interesting. They can think about other things, they can think about other people, even while they're like focused on themselves. They can decenter, they can think more than one dimension at a time. So they're able to think about what's happening beyond themselves, which is not really as possible as a toddler. And then the reversibility. When one change reverses effects of another, you can now infer underlying realities. The book describes this as I think, a math problem where you can say 1 + 2 = 3. You can also say 3 - 1 = 2. Those are different and reversed effects, but children are able to kind of reason and logic this out at this point. And they're the most logical when solving concrete problems. If you give them a problem, like a word problem to solve, that's a logic-based one, they're pretty decent at it for the most part. And logical thinking can be domain specific. This would be children's interest areas. Wherever they're most interested in, they're probably going to have better logical skills at this point, instead of kind of generalized over all of their interests. An alternate perspective, the information processing approach. Cognition compared to the functioning of a computer. So this is a little bit different than what Piaget is talking about with their concrete operational stage, because cognition can be compared to a functioning of a computer. Children and adults often will learn in almost like a file kind of situation, and also like pulling up website kind of situation. Organization and the quality of thinking tends to stay the same across all ages, but a change in amount and efficiency of information processing, so the amount that people are able to think about, changes throughout time, which kind of makes sense. That, you're always going to think about the same, like what you're going to be thinking about, but you're able to think more as you get older. And then like I was saying with ADHD, there's some impairment in executive functioning skills in ADHD. As you age throughout time, you're supposed to be developing executive function skills. Executive function skills are self-regulation, stopping yourself from doing some things you're not supposed to do, having good attention, good working memory, problem solving, organization. The list is very long for executive function skills. It's also multitasking and splitting your attention. and resuming skills. Those are all executive function skills that children aren't necessarily the best at, but they start to develop those around this time. And you can kind of see it in action, which is very cool. There are two kinds of memory and knowledge. And again, your memory will improve until young adulthood. And then you're kind of like, what you remember is what the amount that you can usually remember once you reach early adulthood. There's two kinds of remembering or retrieval. Recognition, which is realizing information is familiar. Obviously, recognize is the base word of that, and that makes sense. And then there's recall, drawing information from your long-term memory. If you pull a memory back from your childhood, that's your recall. But if you happen to go to a place and recognize it as a place from your early childhood, that's recognition. And then if it associates with a memory, that's recall again. Then there's sensory memory, which is using our senses. It is very quick. It happens like almost immediately, and it remains consistent throughout our lives. It's one type of memory that stays consistent. And we often will recall certain, with our recall, we'll have certain amounts of sensory information in it as well. They say that smell is one of the things that helps recall a memory best, which is interesting. Then there's working memory, and that's for focusing, planning, and problem solving. There's several kinds of declarative knowledge stored in memory. There's semantic, which is facts and concepts, knowing things. Say we know how to make a cake, right? We know the ingredient list. And then episodic, events we have experienced. And that's like you remember the last time you made a cake, maybe. And then there's non-declarative knowledge, procedural knowledge, like knowing how. Knowing how might be, have you ever seen the television series Schitt's Creek? There is a specific, very memed situation in it where Moira is talking to David and she's telling him to fold in the cheese. And neither of them know what they're doing, but they keep arguing about folding in the cheese. Folding in the cheese would be procedural knowledge, and neither of them have that in that situation. If you haven't watched Schitt's Creek, don't worry about it. So what else improves with development? Multiple improvements in cognitive skills enhance and interact with each other. There's an increase in working memory, span, and capacity. So you're able to just remember more with what you're doing. Infants are not as good at remembering things. As you get older, of course, you're going to be better at remembering chunks of information. Then there's faster information processing. Your brain just works faster. It's designed to start doing that in our middle childhood. You're able to know more and build your knowledge base deeper in middle childhood. In middle childhood, logical thinking skills really start to emerge. Language skills get better. Their vocabularies are exploding. Their memory strategies, they come up with things that help them remember, chunking information and other things like that. Their memories increase potentially because of that as well. And then there are metacognitive skills, thinking about thinking. They're able to think about what others might think about them. And memory influenced by social developments. Again, like motivation, scaffolding by adults. But those metacognitive skills might be, they're able to think about others thinking about them or just thinking in general. But they do tend to prioritize themselves and their own thoughts in middle childhood. Even though they acknowledge the importance of others, they still think themselves the authority. So that's why a lot of squabbles with friends tend to happen over I'm right, no, you're wrong kind of situations. The book also has a very long section about children's eyewitness testimony that I encourage you to read. Witness testimony is very subjective to begin with. It's not always the most reliable, but that's especially true for children. Children have their own problems with eyewitness testimony and that it can be incomplete, distorted, or wrong. Preschoolers are not really great at knowing what's real and what isn't. There are instances of preschoolers imagining monsters instead of the person who hurt them if they're trying to give eyewitness testimony. But it can also be as innocent as children will make up stories to go along with their experiences, preschoolers especially, that aren't necessarily true, but help them to remember and help them relate. School-age children, though, are generally less suggestible. It's harder to implant ideas in their head, but they're not immune to influence. You can still if you're thinking about eyewitness testimony in like court situations, you can still lead children where you want them to go. And that's not a good thing if you are counselors are not investigators. You don't want to lead a child into an investigation. You just want to be there and be supportive and help the child heal. So there's different guidelines for better eyewitness interviews. Avoid leading questions. So you don't want to lead your person on because that can suggest that they remembered something that they didn't actually happen. Keep repetition to a minimum. There's no reason to keep repeating themselves if you already have the point across. Use an emotionally neutral tone. Don't get agitated. And this is true. I would say the emotionally neutral tone is probably true for a lot of sessions, counseling sessions in general. But keep an emotionally neutral tone because your shock, if it shows up, might alienate your client, and you don't want that at all. You don't want that distance or that distraction there. Avoid stereotypes, inducing stereotypes into your interview, and don't use inducements at all. The book also talks about cognitive development in a wired world with lots of screens. Children under age 2, you are better off just not having any screen time, any wires at all. If you must, make sure it's educational. And that's especially true for preschoolers as well. Educational versus entertainment media differ in visual and auditory pacing and language use. If it's educational, it's going to be a little bit slower. It's going to be helping them develop certain skills. Entertainment media, if they target it for preschoolers, it can impair attention quite a bit and cause some frustration for the child. Children who watch a lot more entertainment media versus educational media in preschool ages will have a lot more attention and negative social interactions with others, attention issues, I should say. With older children and adolescents, control exposure, set limits. Entertainment media doesn't become as much of a problem in older children and adolescents. However, violent media can often lead to like some aggressive tendencies. You might hear some kind of outdated information about screens and violent video games causing children to be violent. And that's not exactly true. It does cause them to be a little bit more aggressive, but it does not lead to children committing violence against each other or against themselves. That's not likely to happen. But fast-paced, violent media is not necessarily helpful for all children. I do want to point out that video games that are not violent, and the book doesn't address this, but I will. Video games that are not violent are actually really good at a really good self-care strategy, a really good emotional regulation at the end of a long day. So things like, I'll say Animal Crossing and Minecraft, that are not inherently violent, might be really beneficial for children and adults. But for children and teens, limit setting on some of those things might be really beneficial. And media tends to displace other important learning activities and social interaction. We just need to make sure that our children are, like we talked about in the last chapter, getting the social interaction that they need. And that's a parental task, like we talked about in the last chapter. Then there's cognitive development and formal schooling. Formal schooling is built around adults teaching children what they need to know to get by. And they're adult scaffolding on what children already know. You cannot teach a kindergartner calculus. It's not going to be very helpful, but you can teach them math. So eventually they're able to learn calculus far down the road if you introduce those concepts early. So that's what the scaffolding is talking about. You can't build on nothing. You can't just introduce completely different concepts and expect children to pick up on them. You introduce them slowly and build on what they already know. And then many factors will contribute to academic success. There's country, culture, population level, educational level of the adults in the country. Those are kind of like broader categories. And then there's the school level. We all know that higher funding schools with higher funding, I should say, are more likely to have better test scores for one. So it's school level absolutely makes sense. Teacher-child interaction level. If your teacher is not invested in your learning, you're not going to learn. That's another, there's been plenty of studies about that. And then each factor moderates each other's effects. So if you have a negative teacher one year, but you've had good teachers the year prior and the year after, your learning is not going to see so much of a hiccup, and your academic success isn't going to hinge on those two, on that one year that just didn't happen to go very well. So one bad experience is not going to impair a child's entire experience, I should say. Then there's 3 categories of effective educational factors. These are like what teachers need to be doing. So quantity, instruction, and practice. This is why children go to school so much. 35 hours a week is usually the time that they're there, maybe longer. Getting a lot of practice and instruction is helpful for children. Then there's the stimulation, engaging environments and content. This is the quality. If we have quantity, this is the quality. So that if you just teach children in boring rote memorization, again, I said boring on purpose, children don't really learn as well then. They need something to engage them, something to make them have good buy-in on what they're learning. And if children can see value for the learning and the learner, if they know exactly like what point there is to their learning, that will often have a better chance of success for the child as well. Immigrant families will have different sets of challenges, though, in schooling. There are lots of different stressors that can impair success for immigrant children, unfortunately, in that they might have to move very frequently. It's very difficult to learn grammar in a school where you don't even speak the language. So learning a whole different set of information in a language that you don't speak. So the new language, and it's very hard to make friends if you don't speak the language. So social context and new language skills will be a pretty large stressor. There's economic stresses from immigration. The most successful people who immigrate have quite a bit of money before immigrating, but that's not always what gets to happen in situations, especially like refugees. They usually don't have a lot of money when immigrating. Then there's health concerns. Children of immigrants tend to have pretty good health, honestly, but their families may have health concerns. That could be why they immigrated. Then there's goodness to fit with school practices. They may not understand the school context or have different knowledge of expectations from previous schools that they've attended to the current school. So sometimes students don't fit. That's true in more than just immigration. And then they have the social experience of discrimination. And it's bad enough when it comes from peers, but I've worked in schools before. It also is pretty awful coming from teachers and staff, and it does happen. So as counselors, we need to be prepared that discrimination might impact our immigrant clients. There are protective factors, though. So it's not all bad if you immigrate to the U.S. As a child. They tend to have a strong and positive ethnic identity. And if they don't, developing that can be very beneficial to them. A strong value for education that's usually instilled by their parents. Like they want to go to school because their parents deem it very important for them to go to school. And so they'll likely be at school. And then there's cognitive advantages of bilingual experience. The earlier you learn 2 languages, the more successful you tend to be. So there are definite advantages for knowing 2 languages. Your brain just develops a slightly different level and pace. So it's a very good thing to be bilingual. And then there's great diversity in the immigrant experience and their cultures. So they can bring a richness and different perspectives. They shouldn't have to, but they can. We can't expect them to be, we don't want to tokenize people, but we do want to value what they've been through and what they're willing to offer. Although that's a little bit less in middle childhood, we'll say. And make sure that you are not stereotyping immigrant children, because each immigrant child is is just as distinct as any other child. Whoops. Next up is social cognition. And social cognition is learning about social relationships and acquiring a theory of mind. Children tend to, at toddlerhood, there's a lot more parallel play than necessarily playing with each other. Their egocentrism in the toddlerhood is more focused on themselves and their ideas of fun, but their children in middle childhood are able to start thinking about the way that their friends feel a lot more. And so they start to move from parallel play to actual play, and they care about each other a bit more. They can understand other people's thoughts, feelings, and desires. That's the theory of mind. And it's critical to psychosocial development. Children who do not develop a theory of mind are less successful in forming friendships, which makes sense. It also, having a good theory of mind helps with conflict resolution. And you're able to understand the expectations of you socially and societally, and to evaluate interactions with others. Having friends can mediate impacts of maltreatment at home. And the Piaget's theories are also dependent on the existence of peers. Children will improve their skills intentionally to interact and befriend others. So it can be a boost to children to want to befriend others. Siblings also improve outcomes across several metrics. Just having a sibling can improve your success and your social interactions with others in Western cultures, less so in collectivist cultures. And then making and keeping friends is just really good all around. Also, I wanted to say this: having good friends can mediate the impacts of maltreatment at home. And those friends need to be consistent, not just making a friend and then having to leave them, which can happen a lot in foster systems. So keep that in mind. Selman theorized several stages of friendship development. Again, I kind of touched on this in the last slide, but stage 0 is undifferentiated and egocentric, 3 to 6 years old. Again, parallel play. They're not super invested in each other. Undifferentiated just means that they don't differentiate between friends. It's just whoever is in proximity to them, they will play with, by and large. Then you get to stage 1, which is 5 to 9 years, and that's differentiated and subjective. Children will tend to start choosing their friends at this point and will be able to differentiate themselves from others a bit better. They might still want to make friends with lots of people, but they will have best friends at this point. And then stage 2, 8 to 12 years. Friendships tend to be a lot more reciprocal at this point and self-reflective. They're able to see themselves in their friendship and reflect on what they're doing versus what their friend is doing and how they interact with each other. And friendships, again, this is the best friend kind of situation. This is a reciprocal piece. And stage 3 is 10 to 15 years, mutual and third person friendships. And these friendships are start to get a little bit deeper, a bit more important. Friendships in stage 3 are very critical to teenage development, and we definitely need to make sure that we're fostering that. And I'll say this about people in between 10 and 15. They're able to take a more detached view of social interactions at this point, which is why me personally, I think we see a lot more drama during this age between 10 and 15. And then the friendships during this age are a lot more about personal identity development. So this is when they start to deviate from what their parents believe to a lot more about like identity development and what their friends believe, because they're trying to figure themselves out and differentiate themselves from their parents. And then stage 4 is late teen plus. These friendships are a lot more intimate, in-depth, and societal, and require a lot of maintenance, just like any friendship that you have as an adult requires maintenance, and it's kind of like constantly needing to be maintained. Not constantly, I won't say, but needs to be maintained in order to be successful. Yeah, there are exceptions to that. Don't get me wrong, but friendships in high school usually are need to like involve frequent communication and things like that. Um, and they're able at this point to understand like cultural differences between friends and among friends in stage 4. And then there's a lot more autonomy in stage 4 as well. And the increasing ability to balance needs for intimacy and autonomy while preserving friendship is what grows throughout these stages. Selman also goes on to talk about the framework, the spheres of influence. Nature and nurture provide a backdrop for psychosocial development. Kids will kind of make friends how they're modeled to make friends. So individual and environmental factors interact. We need to talk about child temperament here, because children are predisposed towards certain things, whether that's because of effects genetically or in utero or in their later environment. Children will be predisposed to certain things. So you can see how being predisposed towards shyness might impede social interaction. Predisposition toward being active might mean that the child will be more likely to choose like sports and things like that. If the child's more likely to be reactive, they might have difficulty making friends in certain ways. So child temperament is definitely going to play an impact on social interactions with others. And then family environment. Children will sometimes befriend siblings, but have different kind of relationship with siblings. They will treat their siblings worse than they would treat friends, but they also honor their sibling relationship. And then family environment, how parents make friends and how parents interact with each other. And then extended family, how they interact with each other will also determine how children will interact with their peers. And then there's internal processes, how children understand friendship, various social skills that they have, what they want to value, what they want to seek in the context of friendship will all come into play as well, or what they need out of friendship. Although those typically are similar, if you, for most people, you have specific needs out of friendships, but those might vary in intensity. From person to person or friendship to friendship, if it's the same person. More applications. Children in the school years need to be successful in the classroom as well as on the playground. So useful lessons of cognitive development for counselors and educators. Knowledge acquisition is a constructive process. Again, that scaffolding piece that we talked about earlier. And then the first step is gaining the child's attention and getting their motivation. Motivation is a temporary thing. What helps a lot more is determination, but motivation gets started. So if you're able to gain a child's attention, then you are a lot more successful already than trying to instruct a child who is just not invested in anything you have to say. You can also help children remember by teaching them strategies. The book talks about several of those strategies. And then students can benefit from cooperative learning. Some recent people are calling this like parallel learning, where students will come together and kind of work next to each other and get a lot more stuff done. But cooperative learning talked about here can be group projects, but not necessarily, but it's children learning together, coming together to learn, and they're able to fill in gaps that others would have and emphasize strengths at that point. And there's normal cognitive development is uneven. So give children areas where they can be challenged in places where they're strong, and don't over challenge them in places where they might need some further assistance, but give them opportunities to grow. And then metacognitive skills. Ability to reflect on people's own, like your own thinking. That's metacognition. That happens during middle childhood. The first component is knowing what you're thinking, and then being able to regulate what you're thinking will also be really helpful to people in middle childhood, because again, this goes back to social cognition, where children want to be friends with people and might change their skill sets to help make friends, but also just regulating what they're thinking is going to be beneficial in counseling processes as well. Because you might assign homework or tasks or to do in counseling where self-regulation will be important, and you're helping build that. Metacognition provides a basis for cognitive problem solving. So you want to work with your client, work with your student to define a problem or goal, and then select a plan to solve that problem or meet that goal. Do that collaboratively. You don't want to make a plan for a client or a student and them not be a part of that. They have no buy-in at that point, and they're not invested in it. So make sure that you figure out what they want, what you both collaboratively want, select a plan to get there, and then monitor progress and keep revising the strategies until you reach that point. And then you've completed the goal. And that you can help clients make that process available to themselves, but that is obviously specific to the counseling process. And then there's PATHS for healthy development, Promoting Alternative Thinking Strategies, or PATHS. It's an intervention program designed to teach problem solving and conflict resolution skills. It includes multiple levels of the social system: peers, parents, and teachers. Children don't exist in isolation. They exist in these vast social networks. So involving multiple groups can really help a child succeed, especially if you do that respectfully. You don't want to have a child feel like everybody's paying attention to everything that they're doing. That's not super beneficial. And then you want to promote emotional literacy, self-control, and problem-solving skills in social contexts and a positive school environment. To allow them to be more successful, because knowing how to get along with others is an essential skill, and it will be an essential skill throughout all of time. And that brings us to the end of our chapter 6 slide.